It feels like forever since the last full-length video, but I'm happy to bring this to you today. My name is Adam. You're watching Weekend Watch Repair. I really appreciate you stopping by. What we have today is a Felca chronograph. This is a Swiss-made cam-driven chronograph from the mid to late 60s. As we do some function testing, I'll let you know, I picked this watch up actually recently at a local watch collectors meetup. And we'll do some function testing. I went ahead and started the chronograph. And one of the reasons I picked this thing up outside of my complete weakness for panda dialed watches is that if you'll notice there, the bottom chronograph pusher both stops and resets the chronograph. The top one only starts it. And so that tells me we're probably dealing with a Landeron based movement, and we haven't done a cam switching chronograph on the channel yet. Every chronograph that we've done on this channel has been a column wheel chronograph. And so at the time when I was looking at this watch, and by the way, I'll tell you later, I did not follow my own advice when I picked this watch up, but I thought it would make for a cool project. It probably needs a service, I thought, when the time I picked it up. And I thought this one might be fun to record. So here we are. Just getting a feel for the overall condition of this watch. I mean, the dial looked quite nice, actually. At first glance, the watch looks clean. It's definitely been worn quite a bit. There's, a lot of wear on the case back. The sides of it, it doesn't look like it's been over polished by any means, but it is clean. And as we get into this watch, we'll kind of find out that someone has definitely worked on this, and recently. And when I say recently, I'd say within a few years, likely. So I put a full wind in it, and we'll go ahead and put it on the time grapher just to kind of get a base reading. Beat air is actually fantastic. The amplitude's low. It's running slow. The lift angle where it says LA on the time grapher, see where it says 42 degrees. That's a really shallow lift angle. And I was just guessing that this was a Landeron movement at the time. I hadn't opened it up yet. And most Landeron, especially the Landeron 48 based chronographs, which I was assuming this was, are 42 degrees. So most of them you'll see 52 degrees or somewhere close to there. But these have a very shallow lift angle. So now that we know where we stand as far as how this watch is running, we can go ahead and pop this case back off. This has a snap-on case back, so I'm just using a little bit of plastic here in my tool to go ahead and pop that cap off, and that actually popped off way, way too easy. Way too easy. It was not held in there very tight at all. But we'll go ahead and take a look at this movement. One of the first things I really like to do is just do a very thorough once-over of these chronograph movements just to see what it looks like. So first problem here is identified with this arrow is that chronograph driving wheel. That is on upside down. And not only is it on upside down, as we kind of rotate this around, you'll see it's not meshing, it's not level with the coupling clutch wheel. Those should be level. And we'll kind of get into detail later about why those are put on upside down. There's a reason some people do it sometimes. Checking the tooth-to-tooth engagement between that driving wheel and the coupling clutch wheel. I'd like to see it a little bit deeper than that. On these chronograph drivetrains, it's wheel to wheel, so you need that depth to be deeper than one would normally think. From the coupling clutch wheel to the chronograph runner wheel, that engagement is way short. That should be 80 to 90% deep on there, so that's out of adjustment right there. We will definitely need to deal with that. And now I want to check the rollover of the minute recorder. So you'll see a finger come off of this chrono runner wheel here. It'll come in. Here we go. And once it hits it, the spring will take over and the finger needs to clear completely. And right there, as you see, it did not clear completely. Check on the rollover at the spring. That looked good, but that spring has definitely got a lot of rust on it. I'm going to replace that because any attempt on my part to fix that rust would probably result in me breaking the spring. But check this out, folks. I've never come across a movement yet that was this banged up. I mean, I don't know how one marks up a movement as much as this thing is marked up. It's crazy. It's like they took the back off the watch and then tied it to the bumper of their car and then drove down a gravel road for 20 miles. I mean, I don't know how you mark up a watch this much. So we'll zoom in here a little bit because I wanted to look at the pallet fork and escape wheel and take a look at that bridge. That thing is messed up. Like, again, I don't know how you mark up something that bad. Our chronograph pusher here is a little bit loose. Not the end of the world. That's easily taken care of. But now we kind of get a sense of where this watch is. Now, all that stuff we saw, it is functioning, but it's cosmetic. And so hopefully the goal is to get this thing mechanically sorted out. And as we dig into this, we're going to find some things where whoever worked on this watch definitely took some shortcuts. And yeah, it's just, I don't really know a more polite way of saying it, but they definitely took some shortcuts. One of them is clearly they obviously did not replace this gasket, nor any gasket in this watch, although someone did work on it, because the movement, albeit outside of it being horrendously scratched up and just thrashed and a little bit of rust and everything else, it's not horribly dirty. So someone's definitely been in here, and I think this is someone trying to get rid of this watch, and the person I got it from definitely had the same thing happen to him. So here we're removing these two case clamp screws, and I wanted to show you, this has something I've never come across before, and quite honestly, it's such a pain in the rear. But you'll notice as I pull these screws out, the case clamps are not coming out with it. And what's going on is here you can see that case clamp, it's actually sandwiched between the bridge and the main plate, and there's a recess cut out on the underside of the bridge where if you rotate that clamp around enough, it'll kind of sit in that recess and become free and clear of the case. The problem is that the thing was so darn stubborn, and there's rust and there is a bunch of gunk in there. It did not want to rotate very much. So I apologize. I'm going to kind of go out of frame here. It'd probably get a little fuzzy on you, but this is real life. This is what it took to get that thing. And finally I got it rotated around enough where it would actually kind of sit in that little recess. See right there? We'll kind of bring it back out here, and it kind of just sits and floats in there. I just got to remember to put those case clamps back in before we, when we recase this watch later on. But the other one wasn't any easier. But once we have those out of the way, and now that the stem and crown are out of the way, we can go ahead and separate the case from this watch. You may notice that is a brand new camera view. Something I'm kind of happy I was finally able to do. The first step is to get the hands removed. And in order to do that, we want to line the hands back up. So right now I'm just reinstalling the stem, and we'll go ahead and tighten this stem screw back down. And now we can align the hands. Once we get the hour and minute hands aligned, we will have to reset the chronograph to get that seconds hand aligned too. And subsequently the minute hand, but I'm not really concerned about that. But I do want to align that minute hand up, or the seconds hand up, with everything else. But right here, you can see this view. One of the things I wanted to do since I first started this channel is I always really like those videos if they're showing watch repair and you have this really clean view from directly overhead. My problem is that I work under a microscope, and even right now, I'm still working under a microscope. So I kind of had to bend the laws of physics and space in order for a camera and a microscope to occupy the same space. And obviously that wasn't successful, but I did come up with a solution that I hope works well. It doesn't, the lens isn't the exact lens I want. Lenses are so unbelievably expensive. So I'm just using the lens I have, but I think it looks all right. I think we can get away with it. I'd like to hear your feedback on it. I think I need to kind of reinforce my mounting system a little bit. I think it shakes a little bit sometimes, but we'll get there. This is kind of a test run in this video for that other camera, but I think it's going to be cool. And the whole goal is to improve, the viewing experience of the video. So, I hope you enjoy it. So removing these two hands, one of the things that was on my mind when I removed these is I was thinking back to that Walkman video, and on those sub-register hands, we learned that all three of those hands were unique to their position. And I wanted to see if that was the same case on this watch. So I went ahead and I'm going to put some Rodico down. And this is problem number one in this watch. I wanted to put these hands on here and take a look at the post to see if they're different sizes, so I would know which one belonged where. And you may already see what's going on if you look at the tips of my tweezers. There's some gunk coming off these hands. And as we go on here, I'm just going to leave the entire bit of footage in. It just starts getting progressively worse and worse and worse. And just to kind of let you know, if you look at that hand on the left, that post on there is a little bit bigger than the one on the right. These are 0.20 millimeters and 0.27 millimeter posts. And quite honestly, that's a bit odd because usually those post sizes are in even numbers. And then I realized as I'm moving this around, I'm like, hey, the paint is actually coming off these hands in blotches. And so what somebody did was repainted these hands, and they did a poor job prepping the hands because clearly the paint hasn't set, and they just gooped it on there, almost like probably like an ice cream scoop. It's just puddled on there. And so the more and more I move these hands around, paint's just getting everywhere. So, I kind of knew at that point we'd have to address it, and I didn't know if I was going to have to find replacement hands or if there's a way that we can clean these up. So that's something I'm going to have to address. But yeah, just as the more and more I just mess with these, it's just getting progressively worse. So, and that's kind of going to be the common thing I find is that I think someone worked on this watch to get it running, get it functioning, but without a whole lot of regard to how well it's actually functioning. And then it was sold off. And at some point, the acquaintance I got this from, I've met him several times. He's a very nice gentleman. He got the watch in this condition, and then I subsequently did. So we're going to have to fix somebody else's handiwork or unhandiwork in that manner. So once we got that done, we released the two dog feet screws. As you saw, we're on the back side of this movement, those little dog feet screws. And now I'm just using very light pressure to separate this dial, just slowly and very gently working it around until it comes to a point where we can go ahead and separate this out. So yeah, it's just to let you know. So it's been a while. It's been a little over a month now since the last full length video. And, I've done, I have a day job, as one would imagine. I don't make my living doing YouTube. And so, for 2 weeks, I took 2-week-long work trips over the past several weeks. And so when I returned from the second one, on that day I returned, there's a local like watch collectors group, or they meet once a month and talk about watches and horology and whatnot. And it was the day I returned. So I decided, okay, I was tired, but I figured I'd go. And so I brought this Seiko dive watch with me, a modern Seiko dive watch, real nice watch. I just don't find myself wearing it that much. I didn't know if I was going to end up selling it or trading it or what. I just figured I'd bring it. And so there were several people there. And this watch was there from a guy I'd gotten watches from in the past. And so we started talking to one another, and we kind of looked at each other and were like, hey, you want to trade? Yeah, sure. So we traded. The problem with doing that is, and the reason I say I didn't really follow my own advice, is that this place is in like where this group meets is in like this. It's a really neat it's like a record store, or they have a bunch of records for sale, and you can play music there, and they have couches and stuff. And there's like a little bar. It's an interesting place, but the light's kind of dim and it's somewhat loud. So since it's so loud, you can't really bring a timegrapher, because it's way too loud for that. It'll pick up all that background noise, and the light's not great. So, you're kind of stuck with what you can visually see on the outside of the watch and poor lighting. So I think I could have caught some of this stuff that I didn't see at the time. And in this trade, we both kind of agree the watches were value-wise, maybe even money. And so it was a fair trade. And, in hindsight, he definitely got the better end of the deal monetarily. But I'm glad I made the trade still. Hey, I like working on an interesting project, and this is definitely that. And so, I'm not short on Seikos, as you would imagine, either. So I think it's all going to work out in the end. Taking a quick look at that balance, it's kind of hard to get a good read on that hairspring. So we're going to separate that for purposes of cleaning and all that later. So we'll get a much better look at that hairspring. So as we begin disassembly of the chronograph, that first part to come off is the flyback lever spring. And then the screw that held down that spring also holds down the hammer spring. And so what I'm attempting to do is release tension on that spring enough to where there is no tension at all when we pull it out. So I'm just incrementally loosening that screw, and then just pulling that spring up just a touch where it finally just kind of pops loose of those indexing pins right there. And now there's zero tension on that spring, and we can go ahead and remove it without fear of the thing flying off. There we go. Next up is our flyback lever. You can see on this screw, we've got 3 slots cut into the head of it, so we know this is a reverse threaded screw. But for some strange reason, I don't know if it's brass or copper, it's probably brass, but we have a thin washer. On a shouldered screw, those are supposed to hold a part down, but still allow it to move, so it's not pressing down hard on the part. Putting a washer on a shouldered screw kind of defeats the purpose of the shouldered screw. You don't want it, to actually clamp down on the part and not allow it to move. So I don't know why that was there. It shouldn't be there. And I'm going to reassemble this thing. When we get to that point, we're going to do it without that washer, and maybe we'll see if there's a problem, but by default, it shouldn't be there. And that looked like the right screw. So the next thing is to remove this hammer assembly. And there's 2 eccentrics that mount this thing down. And so we need to kind of adjust the hammer a little bit to get clearance so that second screw can come out. So this thing is quite a contraption. And on these cam-driven chronographs, the hammer spring, the operating lever, and all that, you'll see on the underside of this is more than just a hammer. There's kind of grooves on the underside of it, like pathways where the operating lever rides in, and then the flyback lever engages with it. And so all that cam-driven stuff is based on that one assembly. Now we have another shouldered screw, and this is for the operating lever itself. The operating lever is the lever that pushes in when you press the start button on the chronograph, that top pusher. The flyback lever, that first one we did, would be the lower button, the arm for that lower button. In this case, both the stop and reset functions. Next up, we want to remove our coupling clutch. So there is a tension spring for this coupling clutch. And we're going to do the same thing on this thing that we did on the other ones. I'll loosen the screw a little bit and then release a bit more tension on that spring. And now that thing looks nice and free. We can go ahead and remove that safely. And you may notice I'm going to go ahead and put all these screws back into their original slots on these shouldered screws. It just makes life so much easier when it goes to reassembly. You're not hunting down the right screw, and there's so many different size screws, and some of them are very, very close to one another. And it wouldn't be the end of the world. And this particular movement, if I haven't said it before, this is a Landeron 248 based on the Landeron 48. The 248s they made from, I think it was 1937, if I remember correctly. They made it from 1937 to 1970. The Landeron 48 family was, it started in the 1910s. And so there were several different models of the 48. You add additional complications like a day or date or moon phase or whatever. And so there's subsequently several different models. And the Landeron 248 was the last update to the base model that was a chronograph only function. Now that coupling clutch comes off, but we can still disassemble that further. This bridge is removable. So we'll go ahead and remove this one screw, and we can separate this coupling clutch and from the bridge and the wheel from the clutch lever itself. Worth noting when we do that, even though on some of these different Landerons, I've worked on a few, sometimes those posts on the upper and lower, they can be different sizes. This one is not, but the wheel still is directional, where you need that center metal hub that the wheel is attached to and that the pinions are attached to is shaped differently on one side or another, and that sets the height when you mount it in the correct spot. So just taking note of that while we remove it so we can reinstall in the same orientation. Next up is the chronograph bridge. And you can see that bridge raise up as we unscrew the screw. There is a tension spring underneath that chronograph runner wheel, that wheel in the very middle, that applies tension to that wheel constantly, all the time. And the reason that's there, and you'll see that little spring as I lift this wheel away, that smooths out the running of that wheel. So it doesn't it makes the wheel run smoother and less, blocky, I guess, if trying to come up with an adjective that will describe that properly. But we'll go ahead and leave that spring in place. That minute counter wheel can be removed. And next up, we have our sliding gear. And so I've pinged one or two of these sliding gear screws or sliding gear springs in the past. So what I'm going to do here, although it's not very elegant and it may not make for, enjoyable viewing, but it is safe. That spring is kind of it's when you set tension on it, there's quite a bit of tension on it. So I like to just loosen the screw and pull it out from the side. And I found if I do that, it's a lot easier. And especially when I go to reinstall it, it's a little bit more of a pain to reinstall in that manner. But I've never actually pinged one off when doing it that way. So that's how I like to do it. I'm probably in the minority on that, but I like doing it that way. So the sliding gear has got two different shouldered screws. We can go ahead and pick that assembly up. Now the chrono runner wheel, and this is on an extended pivot on there. And so the reason that's upside down, that wheel has got on that center hub, there's a fat side and a skinny side. Normally the skinny side goes upwards. That one, the skinny side was facing downwards and the fat side was facing upwards. And the reason that happens is you see me, I'm going to go ahead and pull this pallet fork bridge off and all that. And it was, by the way, we had to lever that one off. But what'll happen is that pivot for the fourth wheel, that chrono driving wheel is mounted to, is a bit tapered. So and they're press fit. So when you press fit it on, if you push it down too far, you can actually widen the hole in that wheel too much. And if you do it too much, the proper repair is to replace the wheel. But in a pinch, or in order to save money, or for whatever reason, you will come across those that all they simply do is just mount the wheel upside down and reset the height. And since the hole that was on the top of the wheel is now on the bottom, it's usually smaller, and you'll get some grip on that fourth wheel pivot. This one here, it was still mounted upside down, and it was still pushed down way too far, and that wheel should have been replaced, but it wasn't. We're going to go ahead and do that. But with that pallet fork out of the way, now we can remove this train bridge. I'm just taking the two screws that were on that train bridge and just taking a look at the heads of those screws to see if they're different. In this case, on this particular bridge, they were not, but it's something to generally check on a movement. If I can't remember before, it's just good practice. What's not really shown there is that bridge was on super tight, so it did spend a little bit gently levering it off. My hands were in the way of the camera footage. That's why you didn't see it, but I levered it off. And then once it came loose, we removed it, and now we can remove this escape wheel. Even though that bridge covered the fourth wheel, we're going to leave that fourth wheel in because we just don't have the real estate right now to remove it. Those pinions are too long, so we just can't remove it without getting the rest of the wheel train off. So our main bridge has got two screws as well. But if you look at the elevations here where those screws go in, they're on two different elevations of that plate. And so that was the first thing I noticed, thinking, okay, well, these probably do have different size heads. So I'm going to go ahead and that's what was going through my mind as I took those off. So I wanted to go ahead and put those next to each other. And you can kind of already tell from this footage, but we'll stick them next to each other and zoom in. And you can definitely see that the sizes of the heads are different. And sometimes the length of the screws will be different also. But always that's worth checking and just kind of making a mental note of which one goes where. But with those loose, we can go ahead and pull this bridge off. And I begin doing it, and I change, and all of a sudden I'm starting to get hung up on my setting lever screw. So we'll change our angle of attack again and go ahead and lift that thing away. And so there's still some items on the underside of that bridge we'll need to take care of. We have our crown wheel and we have our click spring. And so we'll go ahead and disassemble those as well. And you can see where that ratchet wheel was rubbing in there. There's a lot of wear on that bridge. Moving onward, that is a setting lever screw. And I'm going to go ahead and remove this completely. And that's going to release all the tension on that setting lever on the underside. So when we remove our spring, it'll be nice and easy. But you may have seen this one coming. You notice how this wheel's not coming loose. I forgot to do something. One of the very first things. So I'm going to go ahead and put the original audio back in here, and you'll hear my expression of when I found it. Oh, yep. That's kind of what I thought when I realized what I did. I did not remove the cannon pinion, which is about the first thing I should have done, once we took the dial off this watch, but I didn't. So right now that cannon pinion is grabbing onto that center wheel. And since they're press fit together, I'm going to go ahead and have to pull that off from the other side. So we'll get everything else. Thankfully, everything else can come out quite easily, even with that center wheel in place. And that ratchet wheel should come off that barrel. And you notice the teeth on that barrel, there's a plating on these barrels, whether it be rhodium. I think this is probably what is rhodium plated. I'm not entirely sure, but all that plating's worn off. Those teeth are worn, and that barrel just kind of looks worn down, and we'll especially see it when we take that apart. But that thing has definitely seen a lot of use over the years. Now this little camera angle can come in handy. We'll go ahead and flip our movement over, and we can disassemble the rest of our keyless work and motion work, and we can get that center wheel separated. Doing so, as soon as we pull this cannon pinion off, gravity will take over and the center wheel will come apart. So we'll go ahead and get the part out of my tool. There we go. That cannon pinion puller, that cannon pinion likes to stick in there sometimes. The little jaws, you got to convince it to release it sometimes. Now the setting lever spring needs to come off, but I noticed my screwdriver was a bit worn. And then I took a look at it, and yeah, there's some burrs on the edge of my screwdriver, so I need to dress it. And I just decided to leave this footage in, probably because I had a camera angle now where you could see it well. But this is an Arkansas stone, and I have this little tool here. I can just put the screwdriver in, and I set the angle on it. That way I grind the both sides at the same angle. And then we'll go ahead and grind this thing down. And once I'm pleased with the grind that's on there, I need to flatten and level that screwdriver again. And so we'll kind of put it at an angle, and I'll go ahead and flatten the screwdriver. Like nails on a chalkboard. But now that we have a properly dressed screwdriver, as you can see, we can go ahead and remove those screws, and it feels a lot better. And that's something that, there's a lot of little maintenance tasks that kind of go on when you're working on a watch, and you rarely ever see it in like a watch channel. And I've seen a few channels actually go in to make whole videos about that process, and that's vitally important. Those are really helpful videos. But yeah, dressing your screwdrivers, dressing your tweezers. I do dress my screwdrivers. I try to do it, regularly. And even if you're not recording, you will see a difference and feel a difference on those screws when you dress it, because sometimes, you could work on a Seiko, and then you can go work on an ETA, and then we can work on this Landeron. And even if the screw head was the same size, you use the same screwdriver, the slots in those screws can vary wildly. And so you saw my yoke ping off as I pulled that yoke spring out, but I have a backstop there, so it caught it. But the width of those slots in those screws can vary wildly, so you really need to dress the screwdrivers to fit whatever watch you're working on. And your tweezers need to be dressed as well. And if you use brass tweezers like I like to, those do wear down quite quickly. You can see I almost probably due for another one. Mine are starting to get a little fat at the tips because I've worn them down quite a bit. But moving on, for some reason I decided to do the balance jewel before I finished the keyless works, but that got done, and now we can pull out our stem again. And that leaves the sliding clutch and the winding pinion. And right now, just gunk is holding those together, so we'll go ahead and separate that real quick. You can see those two different parts. And that's that. I went ahead and remounted the balance, and we can go ahead and remove this other balance jewel. So this is an Inca block spring. Always trying to be very careful when I open the spring or close it at this point when I'm kind of levering it away, because sometimes that spring can get twisted or kind of kinked at that hinge point, and I don't want to bend it, or at worst case, it'll ping off, and that's no fun. But just being very careful and slow. I'm a fan of Bob Ross from back in the day, and he used to say 2 hairs and some air when he was painting something with just the tiniest touch. And so that's the thought in my process. But the thought in my head when I'm doing that is 2 hairs and some air. But while we have the balance mounted, it's much easier to loosen this balance stud spring or balance stud screw. And sorry for the blurry footage, but we're opening up the regulating pins. Once we have that screw loosened and those regulating pins open, we can flip it over and then just pop out that stud out of the bridge, and the whole thing separates. And now that we don't have any outside influence on that spring, we can take a look at it, and that's not looking too bad, I gotta say. Pretty happy about that. Moving onward to this bridge, we can disassemble the crown wheel. So this crown wheel's got 2 small screws, and these are very small screws, among the smallest in the watch. That balance stud screw is smaller than these, but not by a whole lot. Those are very small. usually when you have one screw on a crown wheel, you can generally, if you think of them as reverse threaded, even if they're not marked with the 3 slots, it's a good practice to, on your first attempt, treat them as if they were reverse threaded. But if you have 2 screws, they don't need to be reverse threaded. But that wheel came out, and that's the crown wheel core. Lastly on here is the click spring. This is under spring tension, but we can go ahead and remove this screw. It won't fly away, but there we go. Pull that spring back, and now we can go ahead and remove our click. I'm going to go ahead and leave the spring in place. That's not going to hurt anything being in there. It'll get cleaned and all that just fine. But that's all disassembled. Moving on to the barrel, we can go ahead and separate the cap from the barrel itself. Then try to pull this lid away. The arbor kind of wants to sit in there, and it's a little bit stuck, so we'll just massage it a little bit and convince it to separate. But woof, there's a lot of wear in there. A lot of wear. We can go ahead now and separate our arbor from the spring. And that one actually came out without too much fuss. That arbor actually looks pretty good if I can hold it. The arbor looks pretty good, but I wanted to take a look at this spring itself. So I kind of lifted up here and pointed under the microscope, and you can see when I focus the picture, that barrel is just banged up, beat totally up. It looks like all the bridge plates on this watch. So at that point, I already knew we were going to replace the mainspring, but I'm going to go ahead and source a new barrel as well. And thankfully, this Landeron 248 shares the same barrel as the standard Landeron 48 and a few other models. And they made these movements in the millions. So it's not terribly difficult to source a new barrel for it. Although that barrel hasn't been made in a long, long time, there's still plenty of them out there. Just taking a look at our spring. That thing is a bit out of flat. We're going to go ahead and replace it, but you can see kind of here it is out of flat. And if you feel it kind of in between your fingers, if you run it across, it's very bumpy. Time for it to be replaced. On this bridge, I was looking at all these screw heads, and I was just terribly displeased at the condition of these. There's some rust and a bunch of marks. And the marks, I could live with considering how the rest of this movement looked, but I did not like the rust. So I decided I want to go ahead and just clean these screw heads up. Now, the proper tool to use is a screw head polisher, or a frog polisher. I don't have one. One of my favorite channels on YouTube, he made one a few videos ago. He does a lot of lathe work and all that stuff. He made one out of brass, and it looked fantastic. I could buy one, but they're insultingly expensive for what they are. So I haven't. And all it does is just make sure that screw is perfectly level when you file it down and polish it. So although, doing it by hand here, it's not going to be perfect. It's not the end of the world. So I've only done 3 of them thus far on here, and you can kind of see those 3. I'm not going to mess with the eccentrics too much, but you can compare those that have been done to the ones that haven't been done. Well, at least to get all the rust out and clean up the screw slots and whatnot as best we can. But I got a lot more of that to go. So I'm onward with that. After all that's done, I removed the paint from the hands. I'm sorry I didn't film that, but remove the paint from the hands, put them through an ultrasonic to clean them. And now I'm using a fiberglass brush, and I want to score and scratch up these hands so that when I'm going to attempt to repaint them first, and we need that paint to stick to it. And admittedly here, I didn't do a good enough job scratching that hand up towards the center of that hand, towards the head of the hand. But I have a very fine oiler, and I'm using some white enamel paint to apply here. And although, like, if you have this watch on your wrist and you're looking at it, it's going to look fine, but I just did not like how blotchy it was and uneven. So I cleaned everything up again, and I finally got a bright idea. I said, Adam, just airbrush it. So I took that white enamel paint and I thinned it out a lot, and quite a lot, and finally found a consistency I liked using this gray Rodico. I'm trying to find any purpose other than working on a watch to use it for, because I bought a stick of this premium Rodico and I actually don't like it. So I'm using it for tasks like that. But as you can see, we got nice, evenly painted hands now. So very pleased with that. Next thing we need to do is remove the crystal. That popped out way too easy. I'm going to go ahead and keep the original audio in here. And yeah, my thought exactly. I'm going to keep the original audio in here, and because I'm trying to see if I can pop this thing back in by hand. And that one was unsuccessful, but we'll try it again here. And see how easy that thing just popped in by hand? Yeah, shouldn't do that. It popped out way too easy as well. And so at this point, I'm just kind of playing with it, but I immediately know the crystal's way too small. Let's see if it goes in again. Yeah, I'm not very coordinated. Yeah, see how easy that thing went in again, and we'll go ahead and pop it back out one more time. Yeah, so that crystal's too small. That wouldn't be necessarily watertight. If it is, it wouldn't be by much. You could probably just ride a bicycle and that thing would pop off on you. So I want to get a measurement of what this crystal was as a baseline, because I know I'm going to need to go larger. So I'm using a set of digital calipers. We'll measure this thing. I'm kind of getting 32.19. We'll measure it in a few different spots. 32.2. And generally you'll get crystals in 1/10 of a millimeter. So we'll measure it once more. Yeah, 32.2. And so I know, okay, that's my baseline. I'm going to see what I can find in a 32.3 or a 32.4. And kind of test fit from there as far as getting a different crystal. That one, if it fit good, we could have cleaned that one up, but it was just too small. At this point right now, I just decided to disassemble the case, and I wasn't sure yet if I wanted to restore the case or not. It's a judgment call on each watch. I personally enjoy doing the casework, but there's a section of people, and I guess if you ask 10 people, 5 would give you one answer and 5 may give you another as far as if you refinish a case or not. And it's a judgment call. I plan on keeping this watch, so I'll do it to my taste, but right now is undecided at this point. So for now, we're just removing those screws and disassembling those chrono pushers, because at minimum, I want to clean these things thoroughly. But the screw for that second chrono pusher that we just removed, it was in there. It was a little bit stubborn. So I'm going to have to kind of use a little bit more pressure to pull that thing out, but now it comes. And that's just old grime and dirt and whatever. But some of these pushers are press fit. Some are screw in. These are screw in. So I'm going to go ahead and use this ridiculously overpriced, albeit very handy tool to remove those. I don't think that tool's been on the channel yet, but I got a bunch of different ends for it and all that, and including the correct size to unscrew those chrono pushers. And there's very, very thin gaskets on those pushers, it was an adventure finding the right ones to replace those. But onward, we're going to go ahead and remove the crown tube as well, because at this point, again, if I wasn't going to restore the case, I would leave this in. If I am going to restore the case, it needs to be out. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and remove it, because I didn't know what I was going to do at this point. But some of these, like these specialty tools like this, they can get really expensive. That one there is a clone, like an AliExpress clone. But I mean, you know what? It cost me 10% what the price of the regular one does. And that thing has removed every pusher and everything I've ever asked it to do without any fuss. So you can get away with those sometimes, and sometimes you can't, getting those clone tools, and that one you can. If you're, not to plug anything, but I do have on the description of this video, there's a link to a Google spreadsheet that's got a bunch of information on it about the tools I use, because I've been asked a bunch, and a patron member asked me, and I ended up making like a spreadsheet of what tools I use and where I got them, and then thoughts on it. Some are good, some are bad. And so if you're kind of getting into it or have a question about something I'm using, 95% of all the tools I use in the videos are on there, and where I got them. If it's an Amazon link, it's an affiliate link. If it's not an Amazon link, it's not an affiliate link, but that's generally where I buy that stuff. Do not feel obligated to use the Amazon links by any means, but if you're just curious about what I use, or there's a lot of parts in there that are good and bad, and notes as well. Moving onwards, again, during this part of the video, I really like to take that opportunity to thank the patrons of the channel. Patrons, your support means an awful lot to me. I wish I was more eloquent and had better words to express my appreciation for your support of the channel. I don't have those words, but just know I really do appreciate you very much. A special shout out real quick to Tim, Bill, Larry, Mark, John, Dave, Jay Cook, Ty, Ricardo, Norm, and Russell, the newest members of Patreon. Thank y'all so much. I really appreciate you. Now we're going to clean our case parts, so let's see what this ultrasonic does. Well, that was a cool little guitar lick. I'm always partial when my ultrasonic plays guitar tunes. I've been a hobbyist guitar player for 23, 24, 25 years, something like that. So, you know, and I haven't improved in 20 of those. But I do like playing. So I always like it when my ultrasonic decides it wants to play a little guitar tune. It doesn't always, though. So as this stuff's cleaning, I'm going to go ahead and I'm getting these jewels set. You can see we got the one cap jewel oiled, and we have that oil ring right in the middle. That's kind of what we're looking for. Did the same thing to the other jewel, and now we did a wash in one dip with this balance assembly. As you can see, it came out of there. It's looking pretty darn good. I used a little oil blower or an air blower to kind of agitate a little bit, and that came out looking nice. We got the balance in, and now we can go ahead and install both of these jewels. Again, just very gently, 2 hairs and some air. Now we can go ahead and lock that spring down into place. Beautiful. Same thing with the other side. And I reattached the wheel, obviously, but I haven't actually set the stud height yet. So once we get the second spring on, if memory serves, I kind of fiddled with this one for a moment. Yep. There it goes. Okay. Clean up a little smudge I saw on the top of that thing. And now we need to go ahead and set the stud height. And so this is an ongoing process. I kind of get an initial setting where the spring's kind of level. You can see just what the tiniest amount there does. And as you screw in the screw, that stud can kind of move a little bit. So you may need to loosen it and tweak it a few times. But that is basically the process. And I kind of get it to where it's close. And this is after that first set. And the spring's close to flat. I think it's riding a bit high in the regulating pins. I could probably push that down a little bit. But once I got it where I liked it, I give it a test. And it looked pretty good. But it wasn't sitting good between the regulating pins. So I made a small adjustment. And we're going to let this wheel come all the way to a complete stop. Because that spring is going to hit those regulating pins one side or another as it moves. But when it comes to a stop, we actually want it resting between those two pins, not actually touching them. And so if you start to see some positional timekeeping differences between dial up or dial down and all that, one of the things that can really cause that issue is those pins. But that looked like we got that nailed down pretty good. So we have a replacement barrel and a brand new spring. So we're going to go ahead and install this brand new mainspring. And what I learned later on in my watch repair journey, just through trial and error, although I did read it at some point, I wish I came across it sooner, is if you have a new mainspring and you're installing it like this, if you push in the bridle in first, it makes your life so much easier. You can get it, you can do the bridle last, but you're going to fight with that spring. And I have certainly done that. But got the spring in, it's looking quite nice. And just make sure that bridle is, when you start to tighten it down, that bridle will eventually kind of go over and hit that lip on the inside of the barrel where it's going to grab. And so it's just a couple millimeters away from it right now. So as we tighten that spring, it'll move over. Arbor went in, and we're applying a bit more. This is HP 1300 for the arbor. And now we can put our lid on. And that's just what that lid looked like when I got it. I tried to scrub that off. It's on there. It's not dirt. It is clean. But in our standard tool, I pressed this thing down, and that lid did not go on completely. So I kind of had to do it by hand, as you'll see here, and you'll hear it click into place. Just like that. Just double checking it, and then I'll put it in some tweezers once I'm done. Inspect it very closely and right here, and we'll just make sure that that lid is completely flush all the way around. One thing I like to do is just kind of roll it up in my tweezers a little bit, looking through my microscope, and everything's looking really good. Now we can go ahead and put our bridge plate back together. Starting off for the crown wheel, putting some oil down there where the crown wheel is going to rotate. You can see those wear marks on the bridge from where it has rotated in the past. And a little bit more on the inside lip of it, and that's where the crown wheel core is going to go. And again, this is held on by those two very tiny screws. So one thing of note, and I'll just to kind of explain it while you see me putting those two screws in, is that if you look at where the barrel and the ratchet wheel sits, you'll see a large wear pattern. And I did kind of check in, shake on everything, and I will put a dab of oil on that before I install it. It's not on camera because once you flip this thing over, you can't really see it anymore. But before it gets installed, it does get a dab of oil on that wear point. So we lubricated our post for our click spring. We'll pull the spring back, put the click into place. And now we need to tighten this up. And again, that is metal on metal contact there where that spring is. So I'll pull the spring back a little bit and apply some heavy grease to that point in there. Now our click spring is done. Beautiful. All right. What are we at? 46 minutes in and some change. And now we can finally start putting this thing together. So we went ahead and pre-lubricated our lower arbor port. We got our barrel in, and now we can put our ratchet wheel into place. That just simply sits on there. And I'm putting a dab of grease in this hole where the setting lever screw is going to go. And we're just going to go ahead and pop that screw into place. Nothing for it to screw into just yet until we start doing the keyless works later. But that's going to hold down our setting lever. And our train of wheels can go in. We're going to begin with our fourth wheel. And that one goes in quite easy because of that extended pivot. That is not the case on this third wheel. It's that thing's got to go down there quite far before that pivot finds its hole. So I'm just very, very gently trying to make sure that third wheel finds its home. And when it does, that wheel will just kind of sit up straight. And so when it finally does find that hole, you'll see that wheel just kind of plop down and right there. Now we know it's in there straight. Our second wheel can go in. So I'm just pre-lubricating that lower port there where it's going to go and meet the main plate. We could hit that from the other side of the movement. It works either way. So I just opted to do it that way. We can get that into place, making sure it's engaged with the barrel and the third wheel. All that's done. Now we can put on our bridge plate. That one actually went on there without a whole lot of fuss, thankfully. And that's going to be held on by those two screws. I made note, again, of which screw went where. So that one we're screwing right there was the shorter head. That one there was the longer headed screw. And just getting them on, not tight. And I made sure the wheels would turn. Now we can go ahead and slide our escape wheel in from the side. And when we put this bridge on, just making making note of that extended pivot on the fourth wheel at first. Once it's past that, we need to make sure our escape wheel pivots in there. And this bridge is a super tight fit. So I'm at first just going to the tap is way too tight for that tapping trick to work. So just kind of go the old school way and make sure that escape wheel upper pivot is in its home. And then I work that thing down slowly to the point where I'm comfortable putting in the screw. So I put in one. That looked good. And you saw some kind of snap back on those wheels. I'll spin them one way and they just spin for a second, then immediately turn the other way. And what's going on there is since we have our main spring in and the click spring in place, it's hitting that click spring and with the tension that's already in that spring, it hits it and turns the wheel the other direction. That little kickback is what I'm looking for too. And if you see a nice smooth stop to that kickback and all that, it's just a sign that you don't really have any impediments in your wheel train and everything's running nice and smooth. Everything looked good there. So now we're down to our pallet fork and our pallet fork bridge. I believe a pallet fork cock on that, since it's actually not a bridge. It's one screw. It's not crossing over the pallet fork. It's just kind of one arm kind of going over that. But we get that on, make sure our upper pivot is in the jewel. That looks good. Now we can go ahead and just work this down. That one there, that was filmed earlier where you saw where we kind of had to lever that up. It's on there pretty tight, but once I get it down where I like it, we can safely put in the screw. After checking free function, normally on a video, this is where we would apply some power and oil the escapement. But on this, we can't apply power unless we do it through the crown, because we don't have a typical, ratchet wheel screw. And in all fairness, and a couple of people have said it, and they're absolutely correct. It's best practice to get the keyless works in and wind it through the crown, because you can take a chance on scratching up, that screw head or something when you're winding it through the ratchet wheel screw. I'm not immune to that. I've done it before. And on the one video where I did do it, I called it out, but it is possible. But on this one, we have to have these parts in to wind it. So we got the winding pinion and sliding clutch in. We're lubricating our stem. And we can go ahead and put this stem into place. Just like that. And now our setting lever can go on. So we just kind of put it on the tip of that screw, and I hold it down with one hand and then screw it in from the other side. Perfect. On the tip of that setting lever is where the yoke is going to engage. So I'm applying some grease there and a little bit of HP 1300 to the post where the yoke is going to go, and then a bit more grease on the inside lips of that channel, inside that sliding gear where the yoke is going to rest. So before it goes into that channel, I am just going to put a little bit of grease on the edges of that yoke where the setting lever is going to engage with it. And then do a pretty poor job, if I'm speaking honestly, about setting it into its final place. I clearly mucked that up. I didn't curse there. You saw that. I said it started with an M. All right. Yoke is in place. And now if we move these around, you can kind of see how that yoke and the setting lever engage with one another. But once we have those together, we need to put in our yoke spring. So before that spring goes in, I'm going to use a little bit of grease on the other side of the yoke where that spring is going to rest up against. And there's going to be constant 24/7 tension at that point. We drop our spring in, and, by watch standards, that's a pretty thick spring. A lot of tension on it. But we'll pull that back, and hopefully, thankfully the yoke didn't go flying like it did when we removed it. So we're good there. A little bit of grease here on the center wheel post. Now we can mount our cannon pinion. Probably thought you were going to get a click out of that, but I got to keep you on your toes. And lastly, some HP 1300 here for the last pieces of the motion work. For that setting gear and for the minute wheel and that minute wheel track. Now we can pop those into place. On this particular movement, that setting gear is not direction. It doesn't have a chamfered cut to the teeth. So that center unit, the center hub on it is actually identical on both sides too. So that wheel's the same. It's the same in either orientation, however you mount it. A little bit of grease here for the setting lever spring, and we can go ahead and drop this into place. But that spring is kind of sitting on the setting lever post by default. So we'll get one screw in first, because that's going to go in quite easily. But since that spring's already set into its final position, I'm going to hold that whole part down under tension to line up that second screw hole and get that tightened down. And now we can just do a final tighten on them. That's good to go. And lastly, just a bit more in that second little groove on that spring for the second position when you pull out your crown. And then when we work that in, that lubrication will kind of work its way in where it needs to go. Once that's done, I'll just do a quick cleanup. And again, I'll go over it thoroughly before we put the dial on, just clean up any excess lubrication hanging around. But once that's done, we can apply a little bit of a wind. And now we can check the action on our pallet fork. Making sure I'm checking the locking depth on that entry and exit stone. It's springing back and forth just beautifully. So I'm really pleased with that. We've moved on here. This is the lubrication for the escapement. So it's just a tiny bit of very special lubrication that's only used in this watch right here between the pallet fork and the escape wheel. And I'm applying a very tiny drop to that exit stone and then working the pallet fork around and applying that to 5 teeth at a time. And this escape wheel's got 15 teeth. And so we do this process 3 times. On higher beat movements, 28,800 beats per second, 36,000 beat per second movements, I'll use a grease. But on the slower ones, I like to use the oil. The grease does work perfectly fine. Now, we've used it on the channel, even on a high beat movement, but I do find On the slower beat movements, if I use the oil, I will get a little bit better amplitude. Okay, now we're down to the balance. So when we're doing this, I'm just trying to locate that bottom pivot in the jewel. Once I see it kind of drop down into place, we'll rotate it around so that the impulse jewel engages at the proper angle to the pallet fork and hope it starts, and it does not. But I can also see that that balance is, it's kind of not in its final spot. So we'll just persuade it just a hair. There it goes. Perfect. All right. I feel like we almost got away with one there. So after we kind of let it run and I kind of work that bridge down a little bit to make sure it's in its final spot, we'll go ahead and tighten it down. I definitely do not want to tighten that bridge down via the screw. I want that bridge to be all the way down before I tighten that screw. So lubricating the train of wheels, we started out with our escape wheel and our fourth wheel. This is the third wheel. And our center wheel or second wheel. That's HP 1300 on that wheel. I used 9010 on the others. And then a little bit of HP 1300 here for the upper port on the arbor. If we flip the movement over, we're going to do our fifth wheel, fourth wheel, and third wheel. And then everything else, the center wheel and the bottom barrel arbor port, we already lubricated when we installed them. So that's all we got to do on that side. Putting it on the time grapher, this is after about 15 minutes or so of running and just a very quick regulation. And it's barely a regulation at this point, but beat error is great. And it was before. Our rate's holding steady. Amplitude in the 260s to start. That's going to be fine. It's probably going to raise up another 20 degrees or so over the coming days. I'll do check it in multiple positions, but this just is a basic, okay, here's how it's running. We can 100% work with this. I'm super pleased with it. Final regulation on these is done when it's in the case. Moving onward, we need to put our chronograph together. So the first thing we do, we have a brand new chrono driving wheel, as you see here. And so this wheel's never been on a watch before. So these are not fit on there loosely. It is quite tight, but those pivots are also quite delicate. So I'm using an older hand press tool that I don't use anymore, but it works great for this. And just slowly and incrementally pressing that wheel down, but I'm not pressing it down all the way because our coupling clutch, it needs to line up with the wheel on the coupling clutch. And so I just kind of get it on there to start, and then I'll line it up later once we get more parts on there and kind of get it into its final spot. This is our sliding gear. And again, this gear is the intermediary between the chronograph runner wheel and the minute wheel. And so when that finger on the chrono runner wheel engages, it hits that wheel turns the minute recording wheel. And so here we are back again with this spring that I took out in a very odd manner. So what we've done is loosen the screw. And I'm going to kind of get the spring and push it over the head of that screw. And again, there's no good way of filming this. Is probably the best I can do. And I'm sure folks who've done a lot of these, they may be laughing at me, but this is the way I like to do it. But again, I've never lost a spring doing it this way. But if you do it the other way with the screw completely out, you kind of have to hold tension on the screw or on the spring as you're putting the screw in place and getting it started. And that can be kind of fiddly. This way, I don't have to deal with that, but I think you get the idea. I am holding tension on it as I kind of push it back in its final spot, but once there it goes, when we get that in there and get that screw completely under the head of get the spring completely under the head of the screw, we just tighten it down fully. Now there's a few places we need to lubricate on this, but you can see that's all the movement that there is. It's just that tiny little bit. But we're going to apply some heavy grease at first to the slots here where those eccentrics ride, or the shouldered screws ride. And then a little bit of grease here for that spring. And lastly, there's an eccentric on the very other end of this, and that eccentric is what adjusts the depth of how much that sliding gear wheel engages closer or further away to the chronograph runner wheel. So as that one tooth rotates around, when it, you saw earlier where after it flipped that tooth over, it bumped it a little bit. That's the eccentric we can use to adjust that. We have our replacement minute recorder jumper spring. Those are extremely delicate. So it looks like there's two screws. One of them is a screw to hold it down. The other is an eccentric. So you loosen the main screw and then you can turn the eccentric to set it, which we will need to do later. But at first we get this minute wheel in, And so there's no oil on this minute wheel, upper or lower pivots. They're totally dry. And we'll set that spring into place. Doesn't really matter where it is at this point, just between two teeth somewhere. And now we need to go ahead and lubricate our chronograph runner wheel. So that bottom of that, then I lubricated also upper on that, towards the wheel, and then a tiny bit on the top of that spring of 90-10. We'll set this wheel into place. As you can see, that spring is always going to put upward tension on it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and press that wheel down at first and then try to gingerly put this bridge into place. Easier said than done sometimes. But I don't edit it out. But I'll mess with it a little bit and then make sure that those pivots are in the jewels. There we go. And now you can see that wheel kind of sits down. Once those locating pins are underneath it, the wheel does sit down just a hair. But I want to just kind of massage that bridge a little bit and push it down a little bit further. And then I'll just kind of, once I'm happy with it, I'll double check movement of the wheels and make sure that everything's good to go there. I don't have any pivots broken or not in their jewel holes. And once that's done, I'll just keep my tool on there and hold it down, set the screw in, and we'll go ahead and get it screwed down. One more quick check just to make sure everything's copacetic. We can tighten up that bridge screw. Just a little touch. Okay, what we're doing here is I'm using some oil to lubricate the hearts on the wheels for the minute recorder wheel and the chronograph runner wheel. You can also lubricate the heads of the hammer, the faces of the hammer. But before we get the rest of the parts on, these wheels are just free moving right now. So you can just put oil on your oiler and put it right at the tip of that heart and press it on. It'll just rotate right on your oiler. And a touch of 90-10 right there on the upper jewel. The next piece we need to put in is the coupling clutch. So there's not a whole lot to this thing. Unlike the Walkman with that Valjoux, that was just one complete unit. It did not disassemble. These do. Some do, some don't. So we got the wheel on, we got the bridge on, and we get the screw put into place. And this screw, it's a very small screw. It only screws in probably 3/4 of a turn. That's it right there. Now I'm just using a very small amount of 90-10 on both the upper and lower pivots on this wheel. And I just want to give it a test with just a puff of air and make sure that it spins freely. That's looking good. So the post this thing rides on, that is an eccentric screw. And we will need to use that to adjust the depth of how much that wheel engages with that chrono driving wheel that we installed first. So I did kind of a sloppy job putting this in. I need to push it over a little bit more to make sure it kind of gets where it needs to be. That's looking better. And we have one more shouldered screw. This screw just kind of holds it down into place. It doesn't adjust anything, but the wheel does move underneath it. So we're going to lubricate that little hole in there for that shouldered screw, and we can go ahead and get that tightened down. But now, first thing we can look at is the depth. And see, notice how I said the fat end and the skinny, and now you can see the skinny end of that driving wheel's upwards. So it still needed to be adjusted, and we also need to adjust the depth of where those teeth engage. So again, it's just very small increments. This is what I'm using here to do it. I'm not pressing it down in one fell swoop. That would likely break it, just microscopic amounts each time. And then I'll just gently work it down. Truth be told, I probably should have the movement not running when I do it, but not a big deal. Next up, we need to adjust the depth, but how these teeth engage. So here you can see me turning that eccentric. And if you watch those wheels, we'll zoom in here, and it will start to work its way in closer. And I'll kind of get it where I like it. That's not looking too bad. Yeah, I can live with that. We look at the height now that we have it set perfectly. I figure that's pretty darn good. So I can live with that. So now there is a tension spring again for that coupling clutch. And you probably noticed there, I put it in. Yeah, wrong hole there, Adam. Oh gosh, I just left something open for comments there. Anyways, We set the spring in the correct location, and now we can go ahead and get our screw started. I'll apply some heavy grease to the tip of this, but since that screw isn't screwed all the way down yet, that spring may not want to sit down completely flat. And you'll see here, as after we set it, it wants to raise up on me a little bit. Not a big deal. Just kind of massage it in place. And once we get that screw all the way down, it'll cinch that spring down flat. Now it's good to go. And just a little bit of cleanup. It's a shame there's not an exhibition case back again on these old chronographs. Outside of them being phenomenal to look at, even though they'll never see it, I always try to make sure I clean up all my little oil spills. So now we're using this other eccentric to adjust the depth between the coupling clutch wheel and the chronograph runner wheel. So really hard to film this and keep it steady. But I'm kind of liking that, and we'll kind of zoom in at a different angle here and see. Now we can kind of see what we're working with. And I'd say that's 80% or so. We could go a little bit deeper, but I let this run for at least 1 or 2 rotations and then make sure it's good. And if you get it too deep, you can actually stop your watch completely. At minimum, if it's too deep, it'll cause way too much tension. You can actually see your amplitude drop. And so there's sometimes if you can use your time grapher to find that sweet spot of nice full engagement where you don't see an amplitude drop between starting and stopping your chronograph. But I got those to where I like it. And now we're going to begin by installing our operating lever. And I'm applying a little blob of grease there where it's going to ride inside that hammer and cam assembly. And there's a little shouldered screw there as well. There's a little dab inside there for that. And so there's a few spots we need to lubricate on this. So with this heavy grease, these slots here are where the hammer spring is going to ride. One more dab in there where that operating lever is going to ride. And I'm putting some HP 1300 here on that post. And that's not even all the places we have to lubricate either. But we'll get this set into place. We need to make sure that that operating lever is in that channel and that that whole assembly is sitting perfectly flat. And so once I like where it is, we need to get those 2 shouldered screws put into place. So just like all the rest, you could lubricate the screws themselves. I'm just going to put a dab of lubrication in the channel and where they ride. One dab here where the back side of that coupling clutch engages with that assembly. And we'll go ahead and get these screws put into place. But again, we'll readjust the position of the hammer so that other screw can have clearance. A little bit of grease here in a few spots. And that last screw can go in. Yep, you thought I probably forgot to clean that thing up with Veronica. I didn't. I saw it. It was driving me nuts while I was screwing in that stuff. Okay, our flyback lever can go in. So again, that's when you push the lower button on your watch, this is the lever that engages. So we're putting that reverse threaded screw down with no washer. And so that engages with a few spots on that hammer assembly. So it's going to hit right there. And then it's also going to hit right on the very tip. I did put a dab of lubrication there right on the very tip of that hammer as well. Or right on the tip of the flyback lever. So we're getting our hammer spring put into place. Go ahead and get our screw tightened down and we can go ahead and set that spring where it belongs. Like I said, we've already put lubrication where that spring's engaging. Now we're going to loosen the screw back up a little bit because our flyback lever spring also needs to go under that same screw. So not a very difficult spring to put in. We need to go ahead and pull it over that post right there on the lever, get it on the underside of it. And when we do, you can see how it pulls that arm back. Now we can tighten that screw down, but we need to put a dab of grease, just a tiny little dab of grease right there where it's going to ride on that post. Okay, now we can set our minute jumper spring. So we have the hammers engaged. And now I want to set this minute jumper spring to where it's sitting dead center between 2 teeth. You can see me turning that eccentric. Once I get it where I like it, that screw to the left of it will tighten back up. So this is the first test. And it just bumps it just a tiny, tiny bit. So we need to adjust that other eccentric pin we talked about earlier. So that when they're at the bottom of the coupling clutch, if you turn that and it'll adjust how deep that wheel engages. So we adjust that out and here's where we're at after that's done. Now we have nice and good, perfect clearance on everything. The final test is just to make sure that that minute jumper spring is set correctly again, and that there's no movement of the wheel when you engage or disengage the hammer, and having that spring set perfectly between two teeth, that wheel won't budge, versus when the hammer's on or off of it, as long as that wheel's supposed to be in the same position. So all that looked great. Got a little bit of lubrication on the cannon pinion. We got our hour wheel on. We're actually finally putting our dial washer on. We're getting close. We're down to the dial. So I loosened up those two dial feet screws that we previously loosened to pull that off. I tightened them for cleaning purposes just to make sure nothing comes loose. But there we go. We got our dial popped into place, and we'll go ahead and tighten both of those back up. Now we're down to our hand. So yes, and I can see there is a tiny little hanger on that hand. I did catch that. You'll see it. It's gone from one of the future shots. I did see that. But just getting that hand put into place. So right now I have that chronograph hammer engaged. It's reset. So I have those hands. I'm mounting them exactly where I want them to reset. And it does not take much pressure on these at all. Very, very light pressure. There we go. Now that hand's set into place. Now our seconds hand, and this is on a normal watch. This is the hand that's usually in the center of your watch that's rotating constantly. On these chronographs, it's right there in the 9 o'clock position. We'll set that one down as well. Very light pressure. And now our hour hand. And so off camera, I was looking at these hands up close, and you can see under macro, when we get in there, these hands are in kind of rough shape. When you actually got the watch on your wrist, it looks fine. You can't even tell, but that hand's definitely seen better days. I took a little leather buff to it, but there's not a whole lot that can be done. And I thought about just putting you can find any number of, Landeron 48 compatible hands of different shapes and sizes and lengths and colors and all that. I just, for now, just decided to keep the original hands. These are you would assume by their age and what they look like, they're original. They're the tritium insert hands. The tritium does still glow barely. So I just decided to keep them for now. Next up is our chronograph seconds hand. And we want to mount this dead center, right on that 12 o'clock marker. And so unlike the Seiko chronographs where you have that, that cut on the hand and that they're kind of mated, you don't have those same obstacles to overcome. I mean, this one doesn't have nearly the challenges that the Seiko ones have to install. But once that's done, we let that run in. We cleaned up our case, decided in the end right now, we're just cleaned it up thoroughly, not going to polish anything, and just kind of keep it as is, let it show what character it does have. Although I think someone has cleaned it a bit. There is some kind of, it's got a bit of an omega flare with those lug shapes. You kind of that faceted cut that's on it. I like that, and the brushing on that actually looks pretty decent. So I'm just going to keep it as is. Reassembling these chronograph pushers, reapplying some lubrication to everything. We'll get that pusher on. Then I'm going to hold it down against the bench and just kind of use that to keep that pusher in place since it's spring loaded, and we can get the screw in. Obviously, that's a weird jump, and the reason that's a weird jump is just because I figured you didn't want to see it twice, and then I didn't have video footage of me pressing in the crown tube. But I realized I hadn't hit record when I finally got to doing this crystal, so I had squeezed down the crystal, and then I realized I needed to hit record, so I did. But you saw me have the tension on the crystal, and then we raised the watch up into that, and then released tension on it. It fit nice and tight. So we have a proper fitting crystal. And by the way, this ended up being 32.4. So we had to do a 0.2 millimeter jump to get the proper fit crystal on this case. But we did. We got it reset in there, and we're going to go ahead and get our case clamps back in. Honestly, a little bit disappointed. It was actually really, really easy to get those clamps back in and then rotated to where they need to be. So we have our original crown there, and now I've got a new crown and stem. And the reason I did that is because the original crown, the crimp on the back side of that was just too much, and I couldn't disassemble it to get that old gasket out of there properly. There's ways some people do it, but just get a crown. It's not the end of the world. And since you'd never know if the depth's going to be exactly the same as your original, I went ahead and opted to get a new stem as well. And that way we can just trim this down. So we have that in. I'm going to go ahead and take a measurement to see how far off this thing is. So again, I'm just using my calipers. Rotate this around where you can see it. And it looks like we're just a little over 5 millimeters. So I mark out that with Sharpie on the stem, and I'm a little bit short on the Sharpie intentionally. And then I even cut a little bit short of my Sharpie mark when I actually trim it. Right there. I'll take it over to an Arkansas stone and just deburr it a little bit so that it can screw back onto the crown. And we know at this point that we're going to be short. But the thing is, you can always be short, but once you cut too much of it off, there's really not a whole, there's not a lot of going back. Because, you don't want to stuff, put something in the tube to fill up that gap or something. So I'm happy to adjust it 5 times if I have to get the right fit. But I don't want to go too long because then you got to buy a stem and start over. But putting it in, that's how far we are. I take a measure of that, recut it, retrim it and then here is third attempt. And now it's right where we want to be. I get that screw in and it's right there where I want it, right against the case. Pull it out, just double check. Everything's feeling great. So I'm real happy with that. We have it fit now, but now we need to, secure it. So what we have here is I'm using blue Loctite. This is not a permanent Loctite, but it is, it's intent on keeping things together. You can remove it, but you better be sure you want to do it. If you do need to remove it, heat helps. I'm applying a little bit of silicone grease to that gasket on the inside of the crown. And now we can thread this crown back onto the stem for the final time. It'll take about a day for that Loctite to set, but once it's done, it's just fine. And although this is a brand new, there was really no lubrication on this stem. There's a little bit on the watch when we lubricated the previous stem, and I'm just putting a very light coat on it. Now we can install it for the final time. That's satisfying. Tighten down that setting lever screw for the last time. That screw's got to work out. All right. It took a while, folks, to find the right size gasket for this case back. It kind of sits in a channel in a different orientation than what you may used to normally see, but I found the right size, the right thickness. And I had to massage that case back a little bit, which you can do. I didn't do it on camera, but because that case back was extremely loose. And the gasket does create some tension, but it still wasn't enough because it had been worn out. So I massaged the inside lip of that case, working my way around it, and then I got a good tight fit on there. Real good positive snap on that. So I'm very pleased with that. So I know I haven't really shown you a whole lot, but we'll do a start. I obviously tested a bunch, but a start, stop, reset. Check the reset here. And that's looking great. Just super happy with that. Finally, it's time to install the strap. And I'll tell you, there's actually quite a bit of time has passed since we got the watch finished to the time the strap came in. And I honestly would have had this video out maybe a week earlier. But I ordered this strap, had it made, and it just took a bit longer than expected to deliver. So I actually put a poll up on the Patreon page and, showed them a picture of what strap I just put on it. I took one from an old project and said, should we release the video now or should we wait till the strap I intended to put on there was in? And I overwhelmingly got a response to just wait. And so, I'm kind of glad I did. I had this feeling that the project wasn't actually finished, but the strap finally came in and I think it just suits the watch great. Really excited to have it on there. Lastly, one more final test. I just want to do another reset test just at the end, just to satisfy my own obsessive compulsive disorder. We'll let this thing run for 4, 5, 6 minutes, something like that. I can't honestly remember how long I let it run. And we'll do a reset test just to see where we end up with. There we go. Bottom button stops it and reset. I am loving it, folks. I am just loving it. So here's how the watch came out. I hope the strap made it worth the wait. For me personally, it did, but opinions may vary, but I do think it fits the watch quite nicely. And I'm glad finally I can upload this video with the proper strap on it and call this project finished. So I'm just super pleased with how it turns out. Here's a quick shot of the watch on my wrist. I'm just really enjoying it. I think it looks pretty good. And one last scroll of the Patreon members' names again. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate your help. And just thanks for everything. On a side note, the previous video we did the giveaway, and I'm happy to say, and in case you need an update, the winner chose to receive the watch that was on the channel. So we'll throw up a picture here real quick. You can see the watch. He's got it on his wrist, and I've talked to him. He's pretty pleased with it. So folks, thanks a bunch. If you liked the video, if you like the channel, please hit the like and subscribe button. You can follow me on Instagram. There's a link on your screen. And we got the next watch lined up for the channel. It's going to be a Patreon members watch. I'm really excited to get started on that. Man, it's a cool watch with a really cool history. So folks, thanks so much for stopping by. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Take care of yourselves and each other, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye.